Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series, we're going to talk about calculating opening and closing balances. We'll start with a quick reminder of how to calculate the first and last date of standard intervals, such as years, quarters and months, and then use those dates to return the first and last values of those intervals. We'll then explain how to use the closing balance and opening balance functions to retrieve the same results using a much simpler syntax. In the second half of the video, we'll talk about working within complete date ranges, where your values might not represent the first and last dates of standard intervals. And we'll explain how to use the LastNonBlank and FirstNonBlank functions to handle those sorts of situations. So plenty to do in this one, let's get started. To get started, I've created a new blank Power BI report, and as usual, we're going to import some data from an Excel workbook. Just before we do that, I want to make sure we've got the automatic date time feature enabled. So to do that, we can head up to the File menu, choose Options and Settings, then choose Options, and then when the dialog box appears, we can head on to the Current File section, choose the Data Load page, and make sure the Auto Date Time option is checked. This guarantees that we get an automatic hidden date or calendar table created for each date field we import into the data model. Now we've done that, we can choose to import some data from Excel. We're going to use a different workbook compared to the movies file we tend to use for examples in this tutorial. So we're going to open up a workbook called YSL Widgets, and I'll drop a link as usual in the video description so you can download that file yourself. And we're just going to select all the three tables that belong to that worksheet or that workbook. So I'll select all three tables and then click the Load button. Now that that's done, let's have a quick look at the data we've imported by clicking the Data View button on the left-hand side. And if we start by looking at the share prices table, the idea behind this workbook, by the way, is that YSL's decided to diversify from delivering training courses into selling widgets and gizmos. We've got two worksheets. The share prices worksheet contains our share price on various dates. We're doing quite well by all accounts. So we've got the open price and close price for our shares on a range of different dates. And then the stock level is the level of inventory we have for the widgets and gizmos that we're selling. And again, we've got different values on different dates. We'll use that a little bit later on in the example. We're going to begin by looking at some stuff to do with the share prices table. If we head back to the report view, I'm going to start by inserting a matrix into the report page, and then I'm going to assign the share price date field to that matrix. So you can see if I expand the share prices table, I've got a share price date. You can see that that's used an automatic date table in the background. I've got a built-in date hierarchy. I definitely didn't create that myself. So I can just check the box next to the share price date and add all the levels of the hierarchy to that matrix. Now I'd like to create a couple of measures, one to give me the sum of the open price and one to give me the sum of the close price. So in the All Measures table, I'm going to right click and choose New Measure. I'll just zoom in the formula bar so we can see what's going on. Let's call this one sum open price, and we'll simply make this one equal to the result of the sum function, looking at the share prices open column. And then rather than type all that out again, I know it's not a particularly long and complicated measure, but let's just quickly copy and paste it into another new measure, and we'll call this one sum close price, and then change the field we're referencing here to the close field. Okay, now that we've created those two measures, we can delete the delete me measure by right-clicking on that. Eventually, right-clicking on that and choosing delete from model, and then we can click OK to confirm we want to do that. And then we can add these two prices or these two measures to our matrix. Let's just increase the size of this to make it a bit easier to read. And I'm going to head to the Format panel, head to the Values category, and then just increase the font size up to about 13. And that should make things a little easier to read. Finally, I'm just going to expand this matrix out into its various different levels of the date hierarchy using the Expand All Down one level in the Hierarchy button. So I'll click that to expand to the quarter, then to the month, and then to the daily level. Now the data that we've imported in the share prices table doesn't really lend itself to being displayed correctly when we have summary levels like this in a matrix for month, quarter and year. If we just imagine for a moment that the values in this column represented, say, sales that I'd made on an individual day, then it would be correct for January to just give the sum for all the sales made in January, then for quarter one the sum of all sales made in quarter one, etc. But that's not quite what we're showing here. The values on each different day simply represent the value for the same thing at different points in time. So the total for January here shouldn't be the sum of everything in January. The value that I want to see for the open price for January should just be the same as the open price for the 1st of January. So the first date of that particular period. So in order to do that, we're going to need to recalculate the start date or the range of dates used for each of these summary levels. For the open price column, we want to refer to the first date involved in that particular interval. So the first date of January, first date of quarter one, first date of 2018. For the close price, we want the last date involved in that particular interval. And if you've been watching previous videos in this section of the series, you'll already know about the first date and last date functions. Let's just quickly include those in a couple of separate measures just to demonstrate what they do. If I create a new measure, I'm going to call this one first date of interval. And we'll make this one equal to the result of the first date function. And all we need to do here is refer to the column which contains the continuous range of dates for the table we're looking at. As we've been using the automatic date time feature, we can rely on the share price date field. So I'm going to start typing that in, share price date, and then I can refer to the date property or the date column of that built-in date table. I can then close the round brackets and hit enter. And then while we're here, why not just quickly copy and paste that into another new measure and change its name. I'm going to call this one last date of interval. And indeed, we can use the last date function to do that. So now that we've done that, we can include these two dates in our matrix, and we can hopefully see that we get the first and last date of each interval for which these measures are displayed. If we just drill back up again, you can see that that changes the first date and last date for the quarters and months and for the years as we go further through the matrix. So now that we have the first and the last date for each interval, we can use those values to modify the filter context for each row of the matrix and get the open price and the close price on those given dates. Let's head to the first date of interval measure first, and I'm just going to modify this one. I'm going to change its name to say open price on first date of interval. So open price on first date of interval, and then I'm going to use the calculate function to modify it. So I'm going to add the calculate function, open some round brackets, and what we're going to calculate is the original sum open price measure. But we're going to modify the filter context by applying the first date function as a filter, hit enter, and that will change the date to showing the actual value. Similarly, we can do the same thing with the last date of interval. Let's call this one close price on last date of interval. And we can use the calculate function to do this. So calculate, and again I'm going to refer to the existing measure, sum close price. And then we'll apply the last date function as the filter that will apply to the filter context. So there's the second measure created. And if we just have a look back at the matrix, let's just drill down to the individual daily level again, so that we can hopefully see that for the individual daily level, things haven't changed. We're still seeing the same values. The first date and the last date of a given date is just that date. But for January now, rather than showing the grand total for January, in the open price, we're seeing the same value as the open price on the first row. And for the close price, we're seeing the same value for the close price column on the last date of January. And that's true for every interval here. So we've got the open price for quarter one, the same as the 1st of Jan. And then the close price for quarter one should be the same as the last date in March. So that would be 31st of March, 4,978. And we got 4,978 there as well. Now that we have the opening price and the closing price for each interval, we can work out the growth for the interval, either as a numeric value by subtracting the opening price from the closing price, or as a percentage by subtracting the opening price from the closing price and dividing it by the opening price. Let's just add another couple of quick measures to demonstrate that. So I'm going to have a share price growth value. and this one's simply going to subtract the opening price from the closing price. So we'll say close price on last date of interval minus open price on first date of interval. And then we can add that to the matrix. Then we can add another new measure just to display that as a percentage. Let's call this one share price growth percentage. And we'll make this one equal to divide, and then we'll refer to the share price growth value and divide that one by the open price on first date of interval. When we've created that measure, we'll also format that one as a percentage, and then we can display that one in the matrix itself. Okay, so there we go. I think we should just tidy up a little bit perhaps and get rid of the sum of open price and sum of close price. They're not particularly relevant anymore. We've established that they're showing the wrong values for the roll-ups. And there we go, there's the final matrix. It might also be nice to display this set of values as a chart rather than as a simple matrix. So let's just quickly duplicate page 1 by right-clicking on it and choosing duplicate page. Then I'm just going to drill up in the matrix so I can drill up to the yearly level. And all I really want to see here is the share price growth value. So let's get rid of all of the other fields or measures apart from that one. Now we've done that, we can change the matrix into a simple line chart just by clicking on that visual icon in the visualizations panel. And there we go, we're seeing the share price growth value by year. And then we can drill down into the year on quarter, year, quarter and month, and even down to the individual daily level as well. Let's head back to the original matrix, and if we just drill back down again to the lowest level, we can hopefully see that the growth we're calculating is between the start and the end of each individual interval. What if we wanted to do something a little more sophisticated? Say, for example, we want to compare each individual interval with the value from the start of the quarter, for example, or the start of the year or the start of the month, it doesn't really matter. Any of those standard intervals, we have functions to calculate both the start date and the end date of. So I'm going to add a new measure. In fact, I'm just going to quickly copy and paste an existing measure. I'm going to copy the open price on first date of interval measure. And having copied it, I'm going to create another new measure, paste in everything I've copied, and call this one open date on first date of quarter, or QTR for short. So here I'm going to get rid of the first date function, and I'm going to replace that with the start of quarter function. And you can guess, hopefully immediately by the name of the function, what that will do. There are equivalent functions to calculate the start of the month and start of the year. And if it was the end of the period you were interested in, there's end of month, end of quarter, and end of year. But for this example, I want the start of quarter. And as usual, I need to reference the continuous range of dates. So I'm going to refer to my share prices share price date dot date field, close the round brackets, and hit enter to create that new measure. So if I just add this one into the matrix, what you should be able to see is that for every single date between January, February and March of 2018, I'm getting the value for quarter 1 in 2018. So that doesn't change until we reach the end of March, and when we begin April, it then starts with the value for the start of quarter 2. If I just drill back up in the matrix so we're not seeing the daily levels, it's a little easier to see the change between quarters. So now I could compare the close price on the last date of the interval with the opening price for the start of the quarter that that interval belongs to. So we can use the start and end of functions to calculate the start and end date of any standard interval and pass those into the calculate function to modify the filter context. But DAX also provides a range of functions to make that syntax a little easier. It's not particularly complicated as it is, but it could be even easier. I'm going to select the close price on last date of interval measure. And I'm just going to copy all that code to the clipboard and then create a new measure. And I'm going to calculate the close price on the last date of the year. So one way we could do that is to get rid of the last date function and replace that with end of year. So we've just seen the start of quarter is the equivalent for the end of the year. So it's not particularly complicated. We can enter that to create the measure and then just drop that into the matrix. I might just need to change the width there to show that it is indeed returning the value for the last date of the year. So the closing balance for 2018 is displayed next to every quarter and month and indeed day for 2018. When we get to 2020 or 2019, gone a little bit too far, sorry, for the close price for 2019, we're seeing that next to every interval there. Now, although that syntax wasn't particularly complicated, it could be slightly easier again. Let's just change the calculate function entirely. I'm going to use the closing balance year function. So you can probably guess what that one does. There are a few extra parameters here to make it a little more flexible than the functions we've used so far. But what I'm going to do is calculate the close or sum of close price measure, and the range of dates I'm going to use once again is going to be the share price date dot date field. Now I could apply an extra filter, but that's an optional parameter, and I can also control the date on which the year ends if it isn't the 31st of December. But I just want to get the exact same results I've already received here. So that very basic pattern, I get the exact same end results. So for 2018, I get the value for the closing price at the end of 2018, and that changes when we reach the next year. As well as a range of closing balance functions, there's also a set of opening balance functions for year, quarter and month, but you do have to be slightly careful about how you apply those depending on the arrangement of data in your data model. I'm just going to make a quick copy of the closing price for the last date of year using the closing balance year function. I'm just going to copy that, create a new measure, and then paste all the code into it. I'm going to get the open price on the first date of the month. Probably should have just written this from scratch, I suppose, first day of month, and then I'm going to change the function I'm using here to the opening balance month function. Again, there's quarter and year variations as well. I'm going to change this so I'm getting the open price rather than the close price, and then update that measure and add it into the matrix. I think we should tidy up a little bit here though. Let's get rid of the growth columns, so growth value and growth percentage, and then replace that with open price on first date of month. Now, you may see a slightly different result than you initially expect here. I don't know if you can make out here that I'm seeing the value, no value for January quarter 1 or 2018. The first value I receive is for February. The value that I'm seeing now doesn't appear to match the start date or the opening price of any months that I can currently see. If I just drill down into the next level, it makes things a little clearer, I think. If I scroll down to the first date of February, I get the value 7,141.59. And if we go back by one single day to the 31st of Jan, we see that's the same value. So the opening balance functions don't actually give you the value for the opening balance of the current period. They give you the same value as the last date in the previous month or quarter or year. So this one's going back one day from the start of the month to give me the closing balance. If that doesn't seem to make sense, it makes an awful lot more sense when you don't have separate columns for open price and close price. Often you just have a list of balance values in a single column, and the opening balance of one period is the same as the closing balance of the previous one. So that's why the opening balance functions work like that. Just be slightly careful about applying them depending on how your data is arranged. Retrieving values for individual dates from the share prices table has been quite simple, and the main reason for that is that in the share prices table we're recording a value for both the open and the close price on each individual date between the beginning and the end of the data model. So no matter whether we're trying to get a value for the start or the end of a year, quarter or month, we always know there's a value there to be retrieved. That's not quite the same in the stock level table. If we select that in the data view, we can see that the stock level table is recording the quantity of stock we hold for two different products on different dates. And that's based on a stock check. So the stock checks take place at different intervals. For the widgets column, we're taking a stock check every week, starting on the 1st of Jan 2018 and then every 7 days thereafter. For gizmos, we're taking a stock check twice a month, once on the 15th of the month and then once again on the last date of the month. So you can see there's a bit of a mismatch between the two different columns. Sometimes the stock check dates coincide for both widgets and gizmos, sometimes there's only one or the other. not every single date is represented, so you can see there are quite big gaps in this list. So how does that work when we try to retrieve things for the start or end of different intervals in a measure? Let's head back to the report view, and I'm going to create a new report page. And in here, I'm just going to add a basic matrix again to show the dates for our stock level table. So let's expand the stock level table, then let's add the stock taking date to the matrix. Then I'd like a measure that shows me the sum of gizmos. Let's start with the monthly stock check products. So we'll have a new measure. I'm going to call this one sum gizmos. And then we'll say equals sum, and then refer to the gizmos column of the stock level table. We can then add that one into the matrix. Let's just do a little bit of basic formatting to try to make this a little more readable. So we'll just do the usual thing and bump up the font size, and then increase the size of that matrix. And then we can drill down into it so we can see down to the daily level what values we're returning. Just as with the share prices example, we have the same problem with the summary rows in the matrix, where the values for the month, quarter and year are showing the totals for all of the stock level values within the respective intervals. What we really want, of course, is the value for a single date within each interval. Now if that date happens to be the last date of the interval, that's nice and easy because we've got a stock check for the gizmos product happening on the end date of each month, which also means we have the end date of a quarter and of course the end date of a year. So we could just use our LastDate function to get the stock level on the last date of each interval. Let's just do that one quickly. Let's have a new measure in the all measures table. And I'm going to call this one gizmos quantity, or something along those lines, gizmos QTY on last date of interval. And to do this, we can just use the calculate function. We can refer to our sum of gizmos measure, and then we can refer to the last date function, and then refer to the stock taking date. So don't forget we're in a different table now, so we want to refer to the calendar table associated with the stock taking date column. So we can refer to the date column of that built-in automatic date table, close the round brackets for the calculate function, and then we can add this new measure into the matrix and see that we get the value of stock for the last date of each interval shown next to every individual row in the matrix. So at this point we could get rid of the original sum of gizmos measure. We don't really need that one anymore, it's not showing us the right value anyway, and that's what we end up with. Because we have a value for the last date of each month, we could also use the end of month, quarter or year functions, or the closing balance month, quarter or year. Let's just quickly demonstrate that by copying the gizmos quantity on last date of interval measure. And then we can create a new measure, and we'll use this one to show the quantity of gizmos on the last date of the month. So let's just modify the name there to change interval to month or MTH. And then we can change the last date function to say end of month. If we just update that measure now, I'm just going to drill up in the matrix one level so we can just see things at the monthly level to begin with. And then I'm going to add that new measure into the matrix, just so you can see that when we're looking at things from the monthly level upwards, we get the same results. If I just drill into any individual month, however, the results here are a little different. Hopefully you can see the big difference is that the end of month function calculates the end of the month for every single date in the month. So it's not just the dates which have values for the gizmos quantity or the stock checks for gizmos, we get a value for every single date in the month. What you can hopefully see is that the stock take on the 15th, although we can see the original stock take value in the last date of interval. So the last date of the interval for the 15th of Jan is of course the 15th of Jan. The last date of the month for that interval is the 31st of Jan. So that's why we're seeing the value 218 next to every single row for that month. We'd see the same effect here if we used the closing balance function instead. If we just head back to the gizmos quantity on last date of month, we can modify this entire measure, so we're not using the calculate function at all, we can use the closing balance month function. So for the expression, we'll refer to the sum of gizmos measure that we created earlier on, and then use the dates column for the stock taking date. So stock level stock taking date dot date. So we'll get the same end result here, just using that slightly simpler syntax of the closing balance month function. So because we have a value for the last date of each month, we could use the end of month or closing balance month functions to get the same value. We don't have quite the same flexibility if we want to get the quantity of gizmos held at the start of each month. The main problem here being the fact that we don't record the stock level at the first date of each month. So if we try to use the start of month function, let's just do this even though it's not going to work. We'll copy the gizmos quantity on last date of interval measure again, and then create another new measure and paste in all that code. Change its name to say gizmos quantity on first date of month, and then you change the last date function to the start of month function. This will return the first date of each month, but because we're not recording a value for the first date of each month, it means that when we add that to the matrix, we receive a column full of blanks. So this is where the opening balance functions can come in handy. Let's add a new measure. I'm just going to copy the gizmos quantity last date of month measure, which is using the closing balance month function. Create another new measure and then paste in all that code. And then I'm going to change the name of this one so that it sort of accurately reflects what we're actually getting here. I'm going to change its name so it says gizmos quantity on last date of previous month. Then we can simply change the function we're using here to the opening balance month function. So remember, the opening balance function doesn't give you the value on the first date of the month. It gives you the value for the day before the first date of the interval. So in this case, the day before the first date of each month. And because, of course, we're recording the value for the last date of each month, this will happily return a value for us. So let's just add this one into the matrix, and we can hopefully see, of course, in January, then there is no previous month, so I can't get to the 31st of December 2017 because that date doesn't exist in our data model. But when I get to February, I get the value for effectively the closing balance for January becomes the opening balance for February. So now that we have a value for the opening balance for each month and the closing balance for each interval, we can work out the difference between the two with a nice simple measure. Let's just tidy up the matrix a little bit first though. I want to get rid of the quantity on last date of month and quantity on first date of month measures. Let's get rid of those two. Then I'd like to rearrange the order of the columns so that the opening balance for the month appears in the first column and then the closing balance for each individual interval appears in the second column. I'd also like to get rid of any rows where I don't have a value for the last date of the interval, and probably the simplest way to do that is to just apply a basic filter using the filters panel. So we can find the gizmos on last date of interval measure and then click on the drop down arrow there to expand that filter card. We can choose to show items when the value is not blank and then hit apply filter just to tidy up the display of that matrix. Let's just collapse the filters panel there. That looks a little easier to read, I think. So now we just want to work out the difference between these two values. So it's going to be the last date of interval minus the last date of previous month. So we can create a new measure. Let's add that one in. And let's call this one gizmos QTY change for month or something along those lines. If you can think of better names for it than that, please feel free. So we're going to say gizmos quantity last date of interval minus gizmos quantity on last date of previous month. So having done that, we can enter that measure and then drop that one into the matrix, and we've got the change since the start of the month for each different date. And of course that applies to different levels of the hierarchy quite nicely. As usual, if you want to suppress values when there is no previous value to compare it with, you can use a simple if function to do that. So if the value of this measure is blank, I want to show a blank here also. So let's select our gizmos quantity change for month measure and then we can wrap a simple if function around this. So let's say if, open some round brackets, and then take that expression down a couple of lines. Then we can say not is blank, and then refer to the gizmo's quantity last date of previous month measure, and add a comma there to move down to the next parameter. So as long as that is not blank, then show the result of that basic expression. And if we leave the third parameter of the if function blank, that will return a blank when that condition is not true. So if I just update the measure, it's easier to see than it is to describe, I think. So we've suppressed the values when there's no previous value to compare with. So again, working with this gizmos column wasn't too tricky because we could guarantee we had a value for the last date of each month. Let's move on and have a look at how that applies when we can't rely on that consistency. We're going to look at the widgets column next. So I'm going to make a duplicate of page 2 by right-clicking and choosing duplicate page. Then I'm going to tidy up this matrix by getting rid of all of the measures from the values bucket, so we just keep the original dates in there. Then I want to remove this filter so that we're not showing the filters for the gizmos results. Let's head back to the filters panel, and then we can remove the filter for the gizmos quantity on last date of interval by clicking the little eraser button there to clear the filters. So that should return us to the full range of dates. Now I'd like a basic measure to show the sum of widgets. So let's add a new measure to the all measures table, and we can call this one sum widgets. And this will be equal to sum of the widgets column. And then once we've created that measure, we can add that one into the matrix, and that will automatically filter itself to show the values or the dates for which we have stock take levels for our widgets column. As usual, we have the standard problem with the summary rows in the matrix, where we're getting the total of all of the values contained within that interval. So let's try and solve that using the same technique we've used a couple of times already by getting the last date of the interval. I'm just going to copy and paste the gizmos quantity on last date of interval measure. So this is the one that uses the last date function. So we can just copy that one, create a new measure, paste all the code into it, and then change its name so it refers to the widgets field, so widgets quantity on last date of interval, and then just change the measure we're referencing here to the sum of widgets. So having done that, we can enter that measure, and then we can add that one into the matrix. So when we're looking at the daily level, we can hopefully clearly see that we get the same value because the last date of the interval for any date is the same as that date. If we just drill up to the next highest level though, we've got a bit of inconsistency going on here. We see lots of blank values and then the occasional value for a single month or a single quarter or a single year. So the reason we're seeing values intermittently dotted in this column is because those are the months or quarters or years which have a corresponding value for the last date of that interval. So in April 2018, there was a stock take on the last date of April. So because there is a stock take on that date, we get the value for the last date of April. Likewise, in quarter 4, there was a stock take on the last date of the last month of that quarter. So the 31st of December has a value. So that gets shown for the quarter 4 summary and also for the year 2018. So clearly the last date function isn't going to work here, simply because we don't have a value representing the last date of each interval. But fortunately, DAX has us covered with a different function called LastNonBlank. Now the LastNonBlank function isn't just for use with dates, although you'll probably find it is its most common usage. Let's just demonstrate how it works quickly with a new measure. I'm going to call this one widgets QTY last stock date or last stock take, something along those lines. And we'll make this one equal to the LastNonBlank function. Now I'm going to use this one first of all to return the date for the last stock take. So the two parameters we need to fill in is the column name. The column name is the column you're returning a value from. So this is going to be the stock taking date.date column. And then you need to evaluate an expression. And the expression I'm going to evaluate is the widgets sum, or the sum of widgets, I should say. So when that returns a non-blank value, we'll get the date for that non-blank value of sum of widgets. So we can enter that measure, and then we can add this one into the matrix, and we should see now that we get a date for each individual interval we've got displayed. So the last non-blank date for any individual date, once again, is just the date itself. But we can see here for the last non-blank date for January, we're getting the date for the last stock take we performed. So now we can use that in a standard calculate function to modify the filter context. So let's go back to the widgets quantity last stock take, and then we can use this as a filter for the calculate function. So let's wrap a calculate function around this, and I'll take this one down a couple of lines. We're going to calculate the sum of widgets, and we're going to apply a filter using the last non-blank date for the sum of widgets. We need to close the extra set of round brackets for the calculate function. That's the entire measure created. And now finally we can see we get a value for every level of the date hierarchy using the last non-blank function. As you may have already guessed, DAX also has a function to get the first non-blank. So let's just quickly copy the widgets quantity last stock take measure, and then we can paste that into a new measure, and we'll call this one widgets quantity first stock take. And if you haven't already guessed, the function isn't called last non-blank, it's called first non-blank. So we can just update the function name, the parameters are the same, there's a column name and an expression. And if we create that measure, and then let's add this one into the matrix, we'll drop this one at the right hand side, and we'll get the value for the first interval, or the first non-blank date in the interval. So again, when that's an individual date, the first non-blank date is the same as the date, but when it's an entire month, it's the first non-blank date in that month. When it's a quarter, the first non-blank date in the quarter, and the year likewise. DAX also contains a couple of similarly named functions which would allow us to get these same two values using a slightly simpler syntax. So just to demonstrate this, let's take the widgets quantity last stock take measure, and then we can copy that one and paste it into another new measure. I'll give this one a really inventive name. I'll just add the number 2 to the end of it. And then I'm going to get rid of the calculate function entirely. We'll keep the last non-blank function, but get rid of the extra round bracket and then just tidy up the indenting there. And then you may have noticed when we were selecting the last non-blank function that there was a similarly named function, last non-blank value. So I'm going to insert the last non-blank value function. And then just to bring back the tooltip here, you can see that the parameter names are the same. There's column name and expression. But this time, rather than returning the value from the column name, the last non-blank value function returns the value of the expression. So we can basically just jump immediately to the result of the sum of widgets, that is the last non-blank one, without having to pass that into a calculate function to filter the results. The same basic idea for the first non-blank value. If I head back to the widgets quantity first stock take, and then copy that one, and pop that one into a new measure. And I'll use a similarly inventive name, first stock take 2. We can get rid of the calculate function entirely, go with the first non-blank function, get rid of the extra round brackets, tidy up the indenting, and then just change the function name to first non-blank value. So having done that, we can drop those 2 new measures into the matrix. Let's go in the same order, so we'll go last stock take, first stock take, and hopefully you can see we retrieve exactly the same values, just using a slightly simpler syntax. So the first and last non-blank functions as we've used them so far are great when we want to compare values in the same interval. So for example, if we want to work out the difference in stock levels between the last stock take and the first stock take of a particular month, or of a particular quarter, or of a particular year, we can just subtract one of these columns from the other to get that difference. What if we want to do something a bit more complicated? What if we want to compare the last stock level for a particular month against the first stock level for the same quarter, or for the same year, or even for the entire data model? To do that requires a little more effort, but it's using techniques we've seen in a couple of previous videos in this part of the tutorial. Let's just have a quick reminder. I'm going to tidy up this matrix first of all. Let's get rid of the sum of widgets and then the last two measures we created using the first and last non-blank value functions. So at the moment we've got a column or a measure which shows the value of the first stock take for the specific interval that the measure finds itself in. I want to create a new measure that shows the first non-blank stock level of the entire data model. So to do that, let's just take a quick copy of the widgets quantity first stock take measure, and then we can paste that into another new measure. And what's a good name for this one? Maybe widgets quantity first stock take ever, or first stock take of entire model, or something along those lines. And all we're going to do here is modify the reference to the date column of our stock taking date field. And we're going to apply the all function to return all of the dates from that column. So having done that, if we update that measure and then we can add this one into the matrix, we should see, once again, we get a value for every single date now, not just the ones for which we've actually taken a stock take, but we can see that we get the exact same value of 48 next to every single row. So it's always the first stock level of the entire model. Now let's say we want to get the value of the first stock take for the year that each interval belongs to. So of course for 2018 that's going to be the same value of 48, but for 2019 that's going to be the value 146. So to help with that, let's grab a copy of the quantity first stock take ever measure, and we can paste that one into another new measure, and we'll call this one widgets quantity first stock take year. So we're going to modify the all function this time. We're going to use another function which you may remember from previous videos called dates in period. And there are several parameters to fill in here, so I'm going to take the first argument we've passed in there, the stock taking date, down to the next line, then just tidy up the close round brackets there. So if I add a comma to the end of the stock taking date field, we've already provided the first parameter with an argument, dates. Then we need to specify the start date. So in this case, I want to begin at the first date of the year. Even if there isn't an actual value for this one yet, that's fine. I just want the start date of the year we're currently in. So to do that, we can refer to the start of year function. And then we can reference the stock taking date column again. Then a comma. Then we have to say, I forgot the close round brackets there, beg pardon, for the start of year function. Then a comma. Then we can specify how many intervals we want to return from that start date. I want to return one whole year. So we enter a number of intervals of 1 and then an interval of year. So having done that, the dates in period function returns all the dates in the year for each interval, and then this returns the value of the first non-blank date in that period, and then we get the result of the sum of widgets expression for that first non-blank date. So if we update that measure or create that measure and then add that one into our matrix, we can see we get 48 for 2018, 146 for 2019, and so on and so on. So at this point, we're really just back to playing around with different date ranges. So think about modifying the interval in the dates in period function to think about quarters or months. You can also think about using some of the other time intelligence functions we covered in previous videos in this section of the playlist. So think about things like dates between, and the date value function, and the date function for entering specific dates. Just to tidy up this final matrix, I'm going to head back to the report and I'm going to get rid of the widgets quantity on last date of interval measure. That wasn't particularly useful. And then if I drill down into the daily level, we're still seeing a lot of dates for which we don't have a stock take value. So again, to suppress those, we could use a simple filter for the widgets quantity last stock date field. So let's find widgets quantity last stock take, and then we can expand that card, find the option that says is not blank, and then apply a filter to that. If we then just hide the filters panel again, the final result looks a bit neater. So we're not going to bother doing the simple measures to subtract one value from another. I think you can easily work that part out yourself. But hopefully the techniques we've covered in this video, when you've got broken date ranges or you want to return a value from a single specific date within a range, have been useful. Thanks as ever for sitting through it and for watching and your support. We'll see you next time.